Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from the Indiana Magazine of History, Morgan's Raid in Indiana by Margrette Boyer. A study of Morgan's Raid in Indiana reveals that it was important in the history of the state and of the nation. It is not from a military standpoint, however, that we can estimate the historical value of this dashing exploit. It had practically no influence upon the outcome of the Civil War, and it failed in all that it meant to accomplish. Contrary to its designed purpose of working injury to the Union cause, the raid ultimately proved a blessing. The state of Indiana seemed for a time to be wavering in its loyalty. The raid offered an opportunity for the Indiana people to show their devotion to the national government, and they did so nobly. Indiana proved herself staunchly bound to the Union. This Morgan's Raid did accomplish, and for this reason, it deserves a place in history. General Morgan's theory of waging war was to go deep into the heart of the enemy's country. He had sought long and earnestly for permission to put this theory into practice. A raid into Ohio had long been his fondest dream, and now, about the middle of June 1863, upon his arrival in Alexandria, Kentucky, the golden opportunity seemed to lie before him. The situation in Tennessee was daily growing more pressing for the Confederate armies there. It was soon evident that some solution for their problem must be found. General Bragg's army lay at Tullahome in central Tennessee, with his cavalry covering his front. General Buckner was in East Tennessee with an inadequate force. General Bragg was confronted by General Rosecrans' superior force, and Major General Burnside was planning an invasion of East Tennessee with his cavalry under Colonel Sanders. Bragg dared not strengthen Buckner, nor could Buckner send aid to Bragg. Unless some movement were set on foot to call away federal attention, the Confederates in Tennessee would be trapped. The situation generally for the Confederates demanded some diversion, and here was Morgan's chance. A raid through Indiana and Ohio, he thought, would call the attention of the Federal troops away from Bragg's retreat, would require that they lessen their forces to pursue the raiders, would prevent the junction of the Federal forces in Tennessee, and would check Burnside's invasion of East Tennessee. Morgan was confident that such a raid would keep the Union forces busy for weeks. General Bragg was shrewd enough to see the value of a raid at this time, but was more conservative than Morgan. He thought a raid in Kentucky alone, having as its object the capture of Louisville, would serve the purpose of a diversion without the unnecessary wide separation of his forces. Morgan said that one of his main objects was to draw troops away from Rosecrans, and that a raid in Kentucky would be too close at hand and too soon ended to accomplish this. Morgan wished to sweep all before him, cut off all railway communications around Louisville so that no reinforcements could be sent there, dash through Indiana and Ohio, and bring the raid to a close at Cincinnati. Buckner would capture Louisville and join Morgan in Ohio. Buckner's part in this plan was prevented by the unexpected advance of Rosecrans. In spite of Morgan's objections, General Bragg's orders stated that Morgan should make the raid, but expressly forbade his crossing the Ohio. With characteristic recklessness, Morgan determined to disregard his orders and make the raid according to his own plans. The raid in Indiana and Ohio in July 1863 was then in disobedience of strict orders. Had the raid been a brilliant success, this fact might have been winked at by the Confederacy. As it was a failure in its object and a disaster to Morgan and the brave men who followed him, it discomfited the South, and they have never quite forgiven Morgan's disobedience. Morgan's confidence in the success of his enterprise was based upon the open disaffection for the Union cause in Indiana. The discontent was roused by the peace Democrats. Letters to awaken discontent and cause desertion were sent into the Federal Army, and the newspapers were full of treasonable articles. Public meetings were held to denounce the government and our soldiers for suppressing the rebellion. General Burnside felt great anxiety at the state of affairs in the Northwest, occasioned, he said, by selfish politicians. The work of the army was delayed because of fears of domestic traitors. It became necessary to call General Wilcox from his plans in Kentucky and Tennessee into Indiana to the difficult task of settling trouble arising from disloyal citizens. Secret societies known as the Sons of Liberty, Knights of the Golden Circle, and numerous others were organized by sympathizers for the Southern cause. While they probably could have done no real harm, and while they were at all times under the thumb of Governor Morton, they did tend to foster a feeling of distrust among neighbors and of discontent and restlessness among soldiers throughout Indiana. Such sentiments, if allowed to grow, would have resulted disastrously to the state. The South had formed an exaggerated idea of the strength and influence of these Southern sympathizers, and it was under this false impression that Morgan entered Indiana, expecting aid, comfort, and sympathy on his way. It is very probable that without this hope of sympathy, Morgan never would have attempted the raid. Morgan was well prepared for carrying out this pet project. His men were in fine trim, and the effective strength of his command, May 26, 1863, was 2,800. The whole force was at this time provided with excellent new clothing and Morgan's favorite guns. Their horses were in fairly good condition, and they could gather others on the raid. The 2nd Kentucky Morgan called his regulars. They had been with him on all his expeditions and were proficient, dashing, and reliable. It is difficult to ascertain the number of men Morgan had with him on the Indiana-Ohio raid. About 3,000 is usually given as his force. Basil W. Duke says Morgan never had more than 4,000 men, and one of Morgan's letters he says he is certain that he can accomplish everything with 2,000 men. Fear and false rumors led to estimates of Morgan's force as high as 8,000 and 10,000. It was not by numbers that Morgan expected to succeed, but rather by dash and boldness, for which he was well equipped. In striking contrast to this able body of cavalry was the unorganized preparation for defense in Indiana when the startling intelligence came that Morgan the Terrible was headed this way. Governor Morton had generously responded to a call for help from General Boyle at Louisville when Kentucky was invaded, and had sent the 71st Indiana 2 companies of the 3rd Indiana and the 23rd Battery. Indianapolis was left with little defense. 2 companies of the 63rd Indiana were stationed at the soldiers' home, and on the southern border of the state was the Indiana Legion, a loose aggregation of citizens with little military training or discipline and practically unarmed. Their most serious need was for cavalry, there being no more than 200 regular cavalry with a small number of mounted citizens. General Wilcox was in charge of the Indiana military forces in Indiana, and he and Governor Morton cooperated quickly and ably in collecting forces. Troops were ordered from Michigan, ammunition from Washington, and all railway cars and locomotives in the state were kept in readiness for the transportation of troops. On July 9th, Governor Morton issued his general order announcing the presence of the enemy, and calling for all the white male citizens south of the National Road to form themselves into companies of at least 60, to drill, arm themselves, choose officers, and await further orders. The men were to be mounted if possible. The Legion officers and leading citizens were requested to assist in carrying out the order and to report to the governor. Gunboats were ordered to patrol the Ohio River, and passenger steamers were pressed into this service. Excitement was at fever heat throughout the state. Exaggerated rumors were afloat. Homes near the southern border were abandoned, and many had forethought enough to hurry their horses northward. Everywhere citizens were answering the call for troops. Grain was left to rot in the fields, tools were dropped, stores closed, books and desks abandoned, and the loyal citizens swarmed to the defense. The roads leading into Indianapolis were clouded with the dust raised by hurrying thousands. Railway trains rushed into the city bearing great numbers of volunteers, and Indianapolis resembled a huge barracks, every open lot and square, vacant building or hall serving as quarters for troops. In 2 days, there were 20,000 troops in Indianapolis, and 45,000 more were organized over the state, ready to move at a moment's notice. This means 65,000 soldiers all collected and equipped in 48 hours, a record of which Indiana can be justly proud. General Wilcox immediately placed these troops where they were most needed. The troops were raw, but they could scour the country felling trees in Morgan's Road and destroying bridges. The Legion and Minutemen, about 2,000 strong, were placed under Major General James Hughes. The forces were divided into the Eastern and Western divisions, the Western Division being at Mitchell and the Eastern Division at Madison on the Ohio, with orders to destroy all boats that might aid Morgan in crossing. At Jeffersonville, $4 million worth of supplies also had to be guarded. General Hobson, with a strong cavalry force, was in constant pursuit. Not anticipating such vigorous defense in Indiana, Morgan, with his entire force, came boldly on toward the Ohio. By Tuesday, July 7th, they reached Brandenburg, Kentucky, about 40 miles below Louisville on the Ohio. While the forces were halted on the riverbank, the steamer John T. McCombs, bound up the river, stopped, as was its custom, at Brandenburg and was immediately boarded and captured by Morgan's men. Signals of distress were sent up by this vessel, and when the Alice Dean answered the call for aid, she too fell into the hands of the raiders. With these two boats, crossing was facilitated and was at once begun. A part of the forces had succeeded in crossing when July 8th a gunboat suddenly made its appearance, causing consternation among the Confederate forces. No shot seemed to harm the gunboat, and had it held its position, Morgan's forces would have been hopelessly divided and the raid nipped in the bud. But as suddenly as it had come, it turned and left the scene. Morgan's men, with shouts of joy, resumed the task of crossing. By night, July 8th, the forces were safely across into Indiana, and having taken everything of use from both the captured steamers, Morgan's men abandoned the McCombs and burned the Alice Dean. It seems curious that Morgan was not intercepted at Brandenburg. He was on the banks of the Ohio for 36 hours, yet he was not molested except by one gunboat, which accomplished nothing. A small unorganized Federal force had gathered on the bank on the Indiana side, but they were soon worsted and driven back toward Corydon, 2 pickets being captured. That night, Morgan's men encamped just 4 miles out of Corydon. Skirmishing was kept up during the night, and plundering began early. The mill owned by Mr. Peter Lapp, which was situated on Buck Creek 3 miles from the river, was burned to the ground. The inhabitants had fled to the woods upon hearing of the approach of the enemy, and pillaging was easy, the marauders finding larders unlocked, fires on the hearths, bread half made up, and the chickens parading about the doors with a confidence that was touching but misplaced. Early Thursday morning, July 9th, Morgan advanced on Corydon. At Corydon was stationed Colonel Jordan of the 6th Indiana Legion with about 400 men. On July 8th, he sent to General Boyle for reinforcements, but these failed to arrive in time to save the town. As Morgan approached Corydon, Jordan fell back 1 mile from the town and formed into battle line. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the attack began and was vigorously repelled. However, Jordan's men were outnumbered 8-1, besides the disparity in arms and training, and could not hope to hold out long. Jordan saw the folly of fighting against such odds, and surrendered with 345 men, whom Morgan soon paroled. The loss to Morgan's forces was 8 killed and 33 wounded, while Jordan lost 3 killed and 2 wounded. Morgan entered the town and took possession. Much damage was done to the stores, Douglas and Denbo Company, clothiers, sustaining a loss of $3,500, while mill owners were forced to pay $1,000 to save their mills from being burned. The women, sulky and frightened, prepared meals at the point of guns. Morgan was surprised to find the country in so thrifty a condition in time of war, more than 500 horses being captured in the vicinity of Corydon. 2 prominent citizens were captured and placed at the front of Morgan's columns as they marched through the streets, and the danger to these esteemed townsmen deterred the people from firing upon the invaders. Leaving his wounded, Morgan hastened on northward, dividing his forces so as to cover a wider sweep of country and to threaten the important railway centers of Mitchell, New Albany, Jeffersonville, and Vienna. There was no guessing in what direction he would swerve, and the people were frantic with uncertainty. Passing north by way of Greenville and Palmyra, the raiders laid waste to Harrison, Crawford, Orange, Floyd, and Washington counties, capturing horses and plundering houses. At Palmyra, the forces halted for 2 hours' rest, but many preferred plundering to resting. A force of some 350 Federals at Palmyra hastily retreated to Salem. By 9 in the morning, July 10th, all of Morgan's men were reunited at Salem, and after a slight skirmish, they easily dispersed the Minutemen and took prisoners a company of the Legion from Washington County under Captain John Davis. At Salem, Morgan's men went wild. Plundering was at its worst here. The depot of the Louisville and Chicago Railroad and the railroad bridge were burned, and the smaller bridges destroyed. The tracks were torn up for a long distance. $1,000 was levied upon each mill, and if payment was not made, the mill was burned. Stores and buildings of all sorts were robbed. Morgan's men seemed frenzied by the delight of pillage, for they would take things for which they had no possible use and which were only a trouble to carry. A dry goods store was entered, and each man grabbed a bolt of calico, unwound it, and threw it away only to get a fresh one. One man carried a chafing dish on his saddle for days, and another a bird cage. Though it was hot July weather, one man rode with a pair of skates which he had stolen, slung across his shoulder. Such conduct continued until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when Morgan received warning that General Hobson was in close pursuit. So part of the town was left in flames as the marauders hastily departed. It was thought that Morgan might try to cross the river at Louisville or Madison, and gunboats were ordered to ply between these 2 points and prevent his escape. By this time, Morgan had so badly demolished the telegraph system in Indiana that couriers were the only communication between federal forces, so messages became confusing and inaccurate. 200 of Morgan's men did reach the Ohio at Bardstown July 10th, but General Boyle reports them cut off by Hobson, some of them being drowned and some captured. Hobson was only 25 miles from Salem when Morgan fled. Morgan passed through Canton, 34 miles from New Albany, and through New Philadelphia, gathering all the horses he could find. He reached Vienna at 6 in the evening, July 10th, his troops being so weary that plundering was largely given up. Here the depot and bridge were burned and the telegraph operator captured. Pressing on from Vienna, they found the roads blocked, so they encamped at Lexington.